I'm here with Nancy Wheeler, current teacher at Cathedral, and I'm here to interview her because she lived during the time period of the Vietnam War. She was born in 1954 and she is currently 6 years old. Mrs. Wheeler, did you have any siblings during that time period?
I have two older siblings. One's 10 years older than me, and one is 5 years older than me. But none were in the Vietnam because we're all girls.
Okay. Um, did the war affect your family in any way? Economically, socially, or politically?
Well, it's had long-term effects politically. Probably not directly, other than my father was a veteran in World War II. He was never in battle, but he was a veteran of World War II. And World War II was a war of clearly good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam turned out to be a quagmire of good and evil being muddied. And so when you have been raised to believe that you go fight and do what's right for the honor of the country, and then you have a war like Vietnam, it causes some dissension in a family. For us, it was never anything awful because my father was always the kind of person who you had to think out things logically whenever you had a discussion. And so it was not like portrayed on television, like the show. A lot of Norman Lear's shows were, if you were conservative, everything was evil. So my father was, even though he was a conservative man, he never expressed his view of Vietnam, but he certainly allowed us to, as long as we had a logical explanation. So from that point, you know, you had to really think through because you've been raised that, you know, you always do what the government says is a good thing, and then this brings up the question of questioning your government. So socially, that was an issue.
Okay, so how old were you during the peak of the war?
Well, near the end of it, I was in college. The huge protests, I would have been in high school, so I would have probably been a freshman, sophomore in high school.
Okay, so you said you were in college. At that point in time, what would you consider yourself on a political standpoint of Democrat or Republican?
I was probably leaning more towards Republican at the time in college.
Okay, and during the time of the war, when you were in college, like, where were you? Like, how were like financially, like?
We were middle class, solid middle class family. I was raised in a very small town. Went to IU when I was in college, and at that time IU was pretty liberal. Well, college campuses were very liberal at the time, particularly anti-Vietnam, because you have to understand a little bit of background. At that time, probably only 10% of the population went to college, if even that. And you could defer out of, if you were drafted, you could defer out of being, having to be in the Army or whatever, by either being a parent or being in college. So suddenly colleges were somewhat flooded with students trying to avoid the draft. But the other thing is, it was very easy for college students to protest Vietnam. And colleges were highly protesting Vietnam. To the point that when I went to college, by the time I was at IU, my age group was so apathetic to the whole thing. The war was almost over. every day the news had been somebody protesting the war. And there had been some pretty ugly things about, like Kent State, some students were killed by National Guardsmen for protesting. No one should ever die from a peaceful protest. There was just a lot of stuff going on. And so by the time my age group got to IU, we were pretty apathetic to anything and everything. I mean, fraternities, sororities were at their lowest. Taking up a cause, nobody cared. I mean, we all dress like slobs. We look like slobs. It doesn't look very much like what college campuses look like today.
And you were talking about the protest. I'm assuming you didn't protest?
No, I did not.
Okay, but would you have taken the chance to if you could go?
At
like
that
DC?
point, no. At that point, I was so apathetic to the whole thing. I would have not thought it was worth my time to protest. As a parent now, and having kids, if I thought that I was sending my son to battle for and to lose his life to a war that mattered to no one except for some people making money off of it, I probably would have. But I did not. When you're in the middle of things like that, you don't understand always the ramifications or the consequences. And that was a war that Congress decided we were not going to win. And I'm not about to sacrifice my son to that kind of a war.
And so what would you say your attitude towards the war would have been?
At the time, it would have been pretty apathetic. Because I didn't lose classmates to the war. I didn't have that direct contact. I did a little bit afterwards, and I'll go to that in a moment. But no, I probably would not have ever protested at the time. Now I look back as a much older woman, having children. If my son was being sent to a war that it was obvious was not going to be won, I'm not about to sacrifice my son in that way. So I probably would have been a whole lot more vocal about it. But I'll give you another example. When I was because the war was fairly long, and when I was in high school, there were college kids that lived across the street from us. I'm from a small town, but it had a college in it. And it's a Brethren college, so it was pretty pacifist. But they were hanging big signs on the front of their house calling the United States imperial pigs. That rankled me because I am fairly patriotic. I may be apathetic, but I'm still. You can argue with your government, but to call it an imperial pig when you had Laos, Cambodia, when those leaders are literally slaughtering people purely because they had an education, because they wore glasses, because they did something that was above the very poor. I really was offended by that. So, then, as I say, as I get older, I see how press can shape what's being said, because that was a lot from the media at the time. So it has changed my whole political view and my social view from the standpoint of I question everything. I don't wholeheartedly believe my government, which in the 50s you believed everything your government said to you. You never questioned it because you never would consider that your government would lie to you. Yet Vietnam was one of those big lies. So.
Okay, so do you have a vivid memory of the war?
My vividest one is I was home from college. This was the end of the war. And the last plane is leaving Vietnam. And you see all these Vietnamese people throwing their children onto the plane, onto Army people, they know that they're going to die because they have backed up the United States. They're just trying to save their children from the communist invasion that's coming. And how awful to have to give up your child but you do it because you want that child to survive, knowing you won't. I mean, to me, this is just like the Holocaust of, World War II, of the Nazis. The only difference is it's the Americans who abandoned the Vietnamese. It's the Americans who abandoned the Cambodians and the Laotians. These are people who went out of their way to support us and to risk everything, and we abandoned them to death. And that affects my thinking today of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of all of that.
How are you?
Oh, he's interviewing me. Give me a second. So, go ahead.
Do you think the United States lost the war?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The only thing that did end up triumphing is capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism, at the end of the day, the Vietnamese, we send stuff there to be made and come back and sold. We never needed to ever send a soldier in. If we had just waited it out, capitalism always rules. It always wins over communism. So it does bother me that like 50,000 men lost their lives.
Okay, well, I'm almost done wrapping up. Probably about 2 more questions. Do you see any mirroring like things with the war we have today? With
Absolutely. Everything we do in Afghanistan, and Iraq, we do with the memory of Vietnam. That's why we will never win Afghanistan. We will never go in with the real thought of winning because it costs too much, and we learned that cost in Vietnam. But we do other things differently. When my husband was drafted, he did not end up in Vietnam, he ended up in Germany. But when he came back, he would not wear his uniform because college students would spit on him. He went to IU on the GI Bill, and he would not talk about even being in the Army. Even though he did nothing traumatic, he had a pretty cushy life in Germany. But it was, anyone who was in the Army was treated very badly, even though they were just ordinary soldiers who were drafted and had no choice. And we don't do that now. Now we honor our soldiers. You go to the Colts game, you go anywhere. I mean, I know when I'm out at Conner Prairie and they tell the people of the armed forces to stand up, and my husband does. Yeah, I mean, kids your age or a little older come up and thank him for his service. I mean, heck, that never happened during Vietnam. They'd come up and smack you or spit on you or say something derogatory to you.
So, concluding this, how would you say the United States was viewed? As like a hero, villain, a fool, like?
I think all of it. There are those who did think that we were there for the right reason. There were people who were probably lead much better lives now because of it. But we were also fools because so many people in Congress lied. I mean, they just flat out lied what was going on. And that's not right. And you don't send kids at the prime of their lives to die horrible deaths in battle like that.
Okay, well, thank you for discussing this matter with me, Mrs. Wheeler.
You are very welcome.
Thank you.